lost private. We're in Normandy.
Thanks for checking in here at the We're Not Lost Private podcast. We appreciate all your support. But do you know how else you can support us? By signing up at Patreon. For $3 a month, you'll have access to all of our episodes, plus access to all kinds of bonus material, like our quarterly newsletter, photographs, and official paperwork, and research that goes into each and every show. You can follow the pod on a multitude of platforms such as YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, pretty much anywhere you catch your pods. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 51 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. And I'm absolutely stoked to have a repeat guest on who I really enjoyed the last time we were on together, Charles Herrick. Chuck, welcome back to the show. It is my great pleasure to have you again.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you very much. You're looking good.
Thanks. You are too. Many of you remember Chuck came on at episode 29 to talk about his book, Back into Focus, and Robert Capa's D-Day activities and all of his very well-known shots. I am very much pleased to have Chuck come back on because he released an outstanding series on his blog about the DD tanks of D-Day at Omaha Beach. Man, that's a mouthful, huh?
I'll be goofing that up all day long. Thank you.
Before we get started, I want to thank a couple of new Patreon subscribers, Marta and Mark. Thanks for coming on to the team and supporting the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I really appreciate you guys. Once we get done with this and I upload the episode, in the episode description, we'll have the URL for Chuck's blog and what this particular episode is based on, so you can go back and do all the reading. And not to mention, we'll also have a link to where you can purchase his book, Back into Focus. And also, I'm going to plug this one because it's always a favorite. Spearheading D-Day, all the special mission units that were attached to the D-Day forces. There's a great chapter here on the specialized tanks that were utilized by the U.S. forces, including the DD tanks. So with all of that said, Chuck, I'm going to turn over the steering wheel to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I guess the best place to start is at the very last act of the story. And I'm referring here to the letter of endorsement Rear Admiral Hall wrote onto the action report submitted by Lieutenant Dean Rockwell. Hall was the naval commander for the Omaha Assault Force, and Rockwell was a man who had trained up all of the LCTs that were to carry the DD tanks in the American sector. And on D-Day, Rockwell personally commanded a division of 8 LCTs at Omaha Beach. As the official story has it, it was Rockwell who decided the sea was too rough to launch the tanks, and after consulting with his Army counterpart, decided to land the DD tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion directly on the beach, ensuring all of them made it safely ashore. Hall's endorsement praised Rockwell's good judgment and decisive action while criticizing that of Lieutenant Barry. And Barry was the commander of the 8 LCTs in the division carrying the tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion. Hall slammed Barry for passively standing aside as a senior Army captain ordered the launching of the tanks in what were clearly dangerous waters. Hall's summaries come down to us through the years as a definitive story for what went wrong with the DD tanks on D-Day. But a close look at Hall's endorsement raises several red flags. One of those is the fact that Hall did not hold an inquiry into the events. He relied simply on Rockwell's report. Further, Hall censored Barry without ever seeing Barry's account. Barry had submitted a report, but he submitted it to his boss, Rockwell, who had already submitted his own report without seeing Barry's. He stashed Barry's report in his personal files, ensuring Hall never got the full picture of what had happened. And this is probably because Barry's report directly contradicted Rockwell on a vital point, as we'll see in a bit. Another red flag is the fact that Hall sat on Rockwell's report until mid-September. Of the 40-plus endorsements written by Hall that I've seen, Rockwell's the very last one he got around to endorsing. In that mind, that kind of means he was struggling to find a way to address a very sticky problem. And the next red flag was that the entire first page of Hall's endorsement was almost establishing an alibi. It was devoted to explaining that he had set out the proper guidelines, but they were just ignored by Barry, resulting in the loss of the tanks. Like I said, it reads just too much like an alibi. But even more suspicious is how Hall distributed his endorsement. He did not send a copy to the 741st Tank Battalion, nor did he send a copy to the flotilla that Lieutenant Barry came from. So the very people Hall censored in his report never got copies of that and were never aware they'd been censored. Further, by the time he sent his copy out to the Army commands, three of those commands, the 1st Army, the 5th Corps, and 1st Infantry Division, well, two of those had new commanders who hadn't been involved in the pre-planning. And the 1st Division still had the same commander, but they hadn't seen the 741st Tank Battalion in months. So at that point, they didn't really care. Further, all the key leaders involved in the 743rd Tank Battalion were either killed in action by then or had been evacuated wounded to the States. So there wasn't anybody in the Army side who got this report who actually was present and aware of the background of what was going on. So that really, to me, said we need to take a closer look at what happened here, because this report just doesn't smell quite right.
Yeah, it seems quite controversial that he would leave it as the last one for him to deal with in terms of the smaller unit after actions and then crafting his own. On top of it all, as we're going to see as Chuck continues his presentation, there's a series of errors that compound the problems that lead up to or contribute to the problems that happen off of Omaha Beach. But it's very interesting that Rockwell is the guy, like you said, who helps run the DD tank training center for the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy. But it's interesting to know that also that Barry had no idea he'd been censored. And like you said, the Army's engaged in the Normandy campaign at this point, and it's all ground. There's no more amphibious assault coming from in this sector unless it's going to be a river crossing. So really, it's kind of you're fighting the fight in front of you, not the one behind you at this point for the Army, I think.
Yeah, they're fighting for their lives, literally.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump back a couple months and then talk about why we needed DD tanks in the first place. During both the Sicily and the Salerno landings, the leading assault waves were principally infantry. And in both those cases, German armor thrusts almost collapsed the beachheads at those two landings. So there's obviously a need to let's get combined arms and some heavy firepower on the beach at the outset early on to suppress the enemy positions. And that was compounding the fact that they knew the Normandy landings were going to be much more heavily contested. The beaches are much more heavily defended. And compounding that was the fact that they had a very short time for bombardment. Not only that, but they had a shortage of bombardment ships. So they only had, I believe it was 30 minutes of bombardment time for the Navy big guns. So they really needed the 75 millimeter guns of the tanks to get on the shore. And they struggled and wrestled around for quite a while trying to figure out how to handle that. And then they witnessed a British DD tank demonstration. The Brits were using Valentine tanks. And General Bradley and his subordinate generals decided that, look, this is the way we need to go. And they decided to go ahead with it using a DD version of the Sherman tanks. And nobody really knew or thought that this was the greatest answer in the world. But like I say, it was the least bad answer. And so they went with it.
Yeah, I want to point out in there, sorry to interrupt you. There's a big misconception about Bradley's desire to have DD tanks attached to the American landing forces. For a long time, the myth has been floating around that Bradley didn't want anything to do with the Hobart Funnies and at his beaches. It's the exact opposite. He was very enthusiastic about the DD tanks. There's a lot of logistical issues and administrative issues that prevented more vehicles being used besides the DD tanks, but he was definitely an enthusiastic supporter of them. And a lot of this had to do with doctrinal issues, if I'm remembering your articles correctly, but also my own studies on it. And I think you correctly pointed out there's a difference if you looked at the way the Marine Corps conducted amphibious operations alongside the Navy and how fire support was conducted in preparation of the landing beaches versus the way the Army and especially our British allies wanted to conduct operations, which was they wanted a night landing or a low light landing because they wanted to utilize surprise. So therein lies the difference in doctrine and the need for now what is this mobile fire support, because you won't have, like you said, the amount of bombardment ships available to you as there are in the Pacific during a number of Marine Corps and Army amphibious landings that go on out there.
Yeah, and you didn't have the 3 or 4 days to do steady naval bombardment that you did in Pacific and other theaters.
So this was the stopgap method in which they were going to provide fire support for the landing forces. One
Yeah.
of many.
You know, initially the Army wanted to just go ahead and land the tanks directly from LCTs at the outset, but the Navy didn't want to do that. They didn't want to risk their LCTs, and
Yeah,
you can understand that. You know,
Yeah, there's shipping restriction. I mean, we look at just like Higgins boats availability, and this is part of the reason why instead of going in like the Americans wanted to do in 42, by 43 they know they're going to go in, and they realized, hey, the shipping's just not there.
Yeah.
So and not only that, the amount of forces that had to be shipped from the Med to the Atlantic to support Overlord, you're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul essentially with your shipping at this point. And so, as you correctly stated, the Navy provided put a lot of value in their LCTs and LSTs, and they don't want to risk them getting them blown out of the water on a hairy landing on a heavily defended beach.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So they did a crash program to start making Sherman DD tanks and ship them over as quickly as possible. And in mid-March 1944, they opened a DD tank school in Torcross, and they put in charge of it a Major Duncan, and he was the executive officer of the 743rd Tank Battalion. And he would train up 6 companies of DD tanks, 2 from each of 3 battalions. 2 of those companies would go to Utah Beach, and the other 4 would go to Omaha Beach. And simultaneously, the Navy tagged Rockwell to be the head of the Navy side of it, train up the LCTs to launch tanks and support Duncan's school of training. Now, despite delays due to equipment shortages and some necessary modifications to both the DD tanks, the first thing that happened when they got in country was they had to go to a depot and have some repairs made to the screens because the design wasn't mature, and they were, quote, repairs to keep the screens from collapsing, which is
and having seen some DD tank examples, and I know quite a few of our listeners and viewers have seen them as well. It is absolutely terrifying concept to me, the way they were designed. Like I read a lot of accounts from both the UK DD tank crewmen and US tank crewmen that served on DD tanks, and to me they were all like felt like dead men walking. To me it just scares the crap out of me. The idea of being locked in that tank with a compressed air blown through tubes to inflating screens, and you're worrying about the sea state. Oh my god, it's just totally terrifying.
I've swum my 113 armored personnel carrier back in the day, and that was disturbing enough. And I can't imagine taking a 35-ton tank and plunging it off the nose of a landing craft.
God bless them.
But anyhow, despite all the delays and everything, by 30 April, the training was basically over. Although there still was one LCT that hadn't joined the formation, a late arriver, and it needed to be trained. But at the end of that training, both Rockwell and Major Duncan, who was, like I said, was the head of the Army School, they filed their reports, and they had 3 items that were basically in common. One was that the tanks shouldn't be launched more than 4,000 yards offshore. The second was that weather conditions should be limited to force 3 for wind and sea state both. And third, that an Army officer should make the launch or land decision. Well, the first recommendation was ignored. Various orders directed the DD tanks to be launched from 6,000 to 7,000 yards offshore. In fact, in a couple British beaches, they said, look, if we got coastal artillery batteries still firing, you launch them even further out than that. And you can understand that precision, but it still was pushing the capabilities of the DD tanks. As for the weather conditions, the initial plan that came out from Admiral Kirk's headquarters, the Western Naval Task Force, those were issued in 21 April. They didn't even have a weather fallback. It's just, you're going to launch them, period.
Plus, much of the training took place in rather, I wouldn't say serene sea state, but completely unlike what was found off of Omaha on D-Day.
Yeah, the beach gradient was different, which made a big difference on how the LCTs could get in. And it appears, I've been trying to verify this, but it appears they didn't have the tidal currents, which probably ended up being a key aspect at Omaha Beach.
And if memory serves from your article, they had to modify the landing ships as well, so they wouldn't damage the propellers of the tanks when they were going off.
Yeah, they had little ramp extensions that would carry them further down, and it also made for a gentler plunge into the ocean because it carried them down. So there are a lot of things that had to come together, and the crews that were used were basically brand new crews on the LCTs. These flotillas had just come from the United States a few months earlier. They'd just gotten in country. They had a whole bunch of things to do in country before they could actually get to do any planning, and they had very little experience as far as seamanship goes. Brand new crews, and so they had a lot of experience launching the tanks. I mean, each one of the crews had gone through the launching evolutions with the 4 tanks at a time, about 10 to 12 times on an average. So they had good experience in that. But as far as the rest of, open ocean sailing, all the other nautical things, navigation, not so much. Now, at Omaha Beach, when Rear Admiral Hall, who was the Naval Assault Force commander, when he started planning, he did tackle the question of a backup. What to do if the weather was bad? And his initial approach on it was, I'm going to let the Army Commanding General, 5th Corps commander, go ahead and make that decision. Well, Major General Giroux, who's the 5th Corps commander, he would be on the USS Ancon, which is 23,000 yards off the beach at Omaha, co-located with Hall, actually. But between Duncan's report about having an Army captain make the decision and rumors coming back that Hall wanted Giroux to make the decision, Bradley got a little upset, I guess, about it, to the point that he wrote directly to Admiral Kirk, the Western Naval Task Force commander, and said that, hey, this is a Navy doctrinal role to get us to the beach. He says, now, we obviously have a role in advising you on that decision, but it has to be a Navy decision. And we don't have an idea of how Kirk answered that. We don't have his letter coming back to Bradley, but we do know that he kicked the order back down to Hall and told Hall to, let's fix this. We need to come up with a better solution. And in doing that, Kirk said, I'm going to authorize you to break radio silence to communicate the decision, which he assumed at that point was going to be Hall's decision, down to the LCTs in case there's a weather problem. Well, when Hall had never been a fan of the DD tanks. He'd never been a fan of the self-propelled artillery firing from LCTs offshore. He was not a fan of the engineer gap assault teams or the tanks that would support them. He'd never been a fan of any of this stuff. So when it's kicked back down into his lap, rather than taking that responsibility on for himself, he kind of shifted away from himself. In his September endorsement to Rockwell's report, he recounted the reasons he felt he couldn't make such a decision. So those reasons were mostly focused on his remoteness from the scene of the launching. He's too far away to make that decision. Well, he just previously told Giroux he could make that decision in the same circumstances from the same distance off. So, so those reasons are not really valid. But apparently there were some kind of touchy discussions about this. Even Hall himself recounted that after some long and serious discussions, that the final decision in his mind was that it would be a joint decision, and it would be between the senior LCT commander and the senior Army company commander within that group. So it would be a joint decision. He never wrote that down in any order. He never issued that in any proclamation or any notes or whatever. And the Army came away from that meeting thinking, okay, the Navy's going to make the decision. They're going to ask us for input, but the Navy's going to make the decision. So right from the start, there was confusion about who's going to do what, who's in charge, and how things are going to go.
Yeah, when you don't write it out in detail, people will assume commander's intent, and everybody's interpretation of that could be different.
And every time you pass it on to somebody else, it gets slightly changed orally.
Mhm.
Now, Hall's operations order wasn't published until 22 May, and in it, he failed to identify who would make the decision. He failed to state any weather criteria. All he did was informed his 2 assault group commanders, the 2 that were going to have the DD tanks, he said that if sea conditions were bad, the tanks should land within the HR wave, with the HR wave. But things had already started going wrong by now, because the Navy planning cycle was a little bit slower than the Army one. But the real key was that the embarkation had already taken place. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But there was a flaw in the original order, and that had 2 of the divisions of LCT tanks, LCT tank carrying, assigned to Utah Beach exercise, and only 1 to Omaha Beach. And it should have been just the opposite way, 2 for Omaha.
Sure.
And at that point, the final rehearsal exercise for Utah Beach had already taken place. And we're not quite sure when this error was rectified and as to whether the DD tanks for the Omaha Beach final rehearsals had gotten straight or not. But that just kind of shows the confusion and lack of coordination and synchronization that had already taken place.
Yeah.
And as I said, the embarkation had already taken place at this point. Rockwell and Duncan had loaded the tanks on the LCTs in Torcross on 16 May. And on 17 May, the LCTs had sailed to their various ports for assembly. The tankers had then been trucked to separate concentration camps. So they weren't with the LCTs, they weren't with the tanks. And that had happened before the Navy orders had been issued and before some of the Army final orders had been issued. So at this point, they're separated, and anything that goes on between them, there's no crosstalk and coordination and communications. Now, the Omaha Beach DD tanks would be carried in on, one of them would be in Assault Force 01. They'd be supporting the 16th Regiment of the 1st Division on the Eastern Beaches. And that was going to be Barry's division of LCTs, and that would be the 741st Battalion's tanks. Assault Group 02 would be Rockwell's. Rockwell had commanded the entire effort, and actually in D-Day, he would just be commanding 1 division. And that would be the division coming in on Assault Group 02, carrying the 743rd Tank Battalions, and they'd be on the western beaches. The problem is those 2 assault groups did not publish their plans until 29 May and 27 May, respectively. So again, the units are separated, and there's no crosstalk possible between them at this time.
And D-Day at this point is scheduled for 5 June. And so there's not a lot of time. Even if they were co-located, it would be very difficult to crosstalk the plan, mesh everything, get the crews synchronized, and get everybody on the same sheet of music for what is going to be a very complicated assault landing.
Yeah.
Just
absolutely.
mind-boggling.
Now, this is where things started going wrong again. Rockwell, for some reason, had placed his 2 tank companies on the exact wrong set of LCTs. So they're going to be going into the opposite beaches of what they should have been. And that was done because embarkation had taken place before the orders had been issued. So that required Hall to issue a change to his orders on 30 May. Now, that probably wasn't a crucial, vital error on the actual execution time, but it was kind of one of those embarrassing things that was indicative that things weren't quite as well coordinated down there as they probably should have been. The second point of confusion would have a lot more serious consequences. Over in Assault Group 01, Barry's division was organized to approach the landing areas in the standard formation. And that was normally his division of 8 LCTs would be sailing in 2 sections. As they approached the beach, the second section would swing on out, and then as they get further on, then they would deploy online. And they would deploy online with the lead craft having both the section leader and the senior tank and the tank company commander in it. And then the following craft veering left and right. Number 2 craft to the left, number 3 to the right, number 4. And that would leave them with 4 craft coming in with the Navy leader and the Army leader in the same, co-located in the same craft. A little bit of unity command there, more or less in the center of their formations as they landed. But when the 2 assault group orders came out, they changed the approach formation. And instead of coming in the standard formation, they would come in a formation that would just go straight in, turn left, and then be opposite the beaches. Well, as the way it worked out, that new leader was what had been formerly the tail end Charlie of the division, who's generally the least capable navigator, which is why he was in that position. And that caused a problem because now Barry, leading his group, he had been in the lead craft in his formation, the original formation. But when you use this follow the leader way, he was in the number 7 craft in order of movement. And that clearly wasn't going to work. But initially, Rockwell didn't pick up on that. He didn't understand the importance of it. Over in his own section, Rockwell had it a little bit easier because as a LCT group commander, he wasn't tied to a single LCT. All he had to do is, when the assault formation was changed, he just moved to what was going to be the new LCT. But Barry commanded an LCT. So wherever his slot was, his LCT was slotted, that's where he's going to be in the formation.
Right. And it's only because of weather happenstance that they actually get to sort this out.
Yeah, exactly. Partially sorted out, yeah. So these 2 points of confusion have taken place now. But when they took a look at the assault group orders, things get more confused. Remember, Hall had kicked the decision down to the 2 assault group commanders. The 2 assault group commanders handled it differently. In assault group 01, Barry's division, in a back annex dealing with landing craft support small, in a footnote, it said that the landing decision or launching decision would be made jointly by the senior Navy officer and the senior tank officer. Okay. Now, whether the Army ever saw that is a great big question. First of all, it was a Navy plan. They did not have access to Navy plans at that point. And it was a footnote in an annex that had nothing to do with LCTs. But at least there was clear guidance of some sort or another. In the assault group 02, it was worse. They didn't address it at all. The decision wasn't delegated, it was just ignored. So during all these developments, the Army continued to believe it was going to be a Navy decision with Army advice. But as a date neared for the invasion, they were working off of totally different plans. And so it remained until the tankers boarded the LCTs about 2 or 3 June. At that time, there was a meeting that Rockwell put together of the senior tank commanders and the LCT leaders. There were no notes taken as a result of this. There's just secondhand versions of what happened during it. But Rockwell pressed during that meeting for one tank company commander to make the decision for launching or landing for both sides of the beach, both Barry's division and Rockwell's own division. The 2 battalion commanders for the tanks didn't agree with that. And what the final decision was that the senior tank company commander in each division would make the decision. Now, everyone assumes that was going to still be a joint decision, that Barry or Rockwell would have a Navy say in that division. But they didn't say that anywhere. And in fact, at the end of that meeting, Barry walked away with the firm belief that the Army was going to make the decision and he, Barry, was simply going to implement it, whatever it was. So you're going into the invasion with completely different views of what's going to happen on all sides of the issue, both the Navy side and the Army side. Nobody was talking off the same sheet of music. And as a result of all that, somehow it had gotten completely turned back around to how it was when Duncan and Rockwell had made their recommendations at the end of training. We're going to let the Army company commander make the decision. And that was just the opposite of what Bradley wanted. So things had pretty much jumped the track at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the decision-making cycle at this point is completely off kilter. In which, and we all know how it ends up working out, but please continue, because this is riveting stuff when you think about it's like one of those command problems. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong.
It's almost like the Empire is testing you with a new problem every step of the exercise, you know.
Exactly.
So with confusion still running wild, the sortie date arrives in the early hours of 4 June, about 3 a.m. The LCT convoy sets sail from Weymouth Bay, only to be called back because of the weather delay. And that was kind of a mixed blessing. It turns out during the sortie, one of Rockwell's craft smashed into another craft and damaged its ramp. Another one of his lost an engine. So that gave him time to repair the ramp and replace the engine for the two craft. But sometime during that, Rockwell realized that, gee, having Barry, the number 7 position in the column he's supposed to be leading, is probably not a very smart idea. So he, at the very last minute, directs Barry to leave his own LCT, go to the tail end Charlie's, the former tail end Charlie's LCT, take command of it, and the tail end Charlie now takes command of the number 7 LCT. And I say very last minute. Barry said he just took over early the morning of 5 June. Well, they weighed anchor at 02:30 5 June, so he only had 1 or 2 hours to get accommodated with his new crew, and then for the rest of the formation realized I don't look there for orders anymore. I look over here for orders. It's just the kind of last minute confusion of command thing that messes things up. And well,
yeah,
that was
not to mention the lack of synergy between Barry and his crew, because although he knows them because they're part of his small flotilla, he's not had a chance to work with them at that level to suss out any kind of confusion or tendencies between the crew members, like how they operate.
Exactly.
He's been on a completely different boat.
There's all that little bit of how people work together that either works well or creates friction, and no time to work that out. Now, that switch was absolutely necessary as far as navigation for crossing the channel goes.
Sure.
But what it did was it broke up now the co-positioning or co-location of the Navy leader and the Army leader, because Captain Thornton, the senior Army captain, he's still stuck back in boat number 7. Well, Barry is up in boat number 1. Well, they start sailing out, and the formation initially for the large convoy has the LCTs in a column of 4 deep. So the left 2 columns are Barry's division, the right 2 columns are Rockwell's divisions. And they come steaming into the transport area early the morning of 6 June. Now, once they get there, they're supposed to reach Point K, and then they're going to break off. Rockwell's division is going to go down the western fire support lane. Barry's division is going to proceed on to the eastern half, and they're going to go down the eastern fire support lane.
Before we continue, I'm sorry, I know you're in a train of thought there.
Sure.
But there was something you pointed out in your article that I didn't know about that was completely flabbergasted me. It was the fact that a Force U small flotilla of LCTs lost its way when coming back to England when the delay went. This also like adds a level of confusion in the launch to get back into position too, because now you have almost like you have these Utah Beach destined LCTs who are almost like mixing up with the Omaha ones, which causes additional confusion. I mean, this is just absolutely crazy to me that this happened even before, like you said, they get into their assault positions. I mean,
Force U, they launched from ports much further west. So when it was aborted, they couldn't make it back to them. So they said, well, let's head to Weymouth Harbor or Weymouth Bay. And so you had this additional cluster right there. Some got into the harbor, some were around the channel. And so it was kind of a giant cluster, and it took them most of the morning to try to even get partial separation.
By the way, I'm not denigrating the performance here, because when you look at this part and parcel of the entire Neptune portion of Overlord, it's amazing that they were able to pull this off in the first place, considering the amount of ships involved, the complexity of all the little sub operations that had to go with, from mine sweeping and lane clearance and lane marking and all these other components to it. It's amazing that they pulled it off in the first place. So I'm not trying to denigrate the performance of the overall force, but there are these little things like
you have to appreciate the terrible context that they were working in. Yeah.
Yeah, that cause a snowball effect that leads to the overall problem when it occurs on Omaha. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's just a massive effort, and the ability to pull it off in the first place, should be commended at the highest levels. But there are things that did go wrong, and you don't learn lessons if you don't point them out what went wrong, and then make evolutions to fix the problem.
Let me jump back for a minute from where I was before. I just skipped a thought, and that had to do with the issue of radio silence. Because once again, the Army and the Navy were working off of different situations. As I mentioned before, Kirk had authorized the breaking of radio silence on the Navy side in order to pass down any messages on the launch or land decision. Hall said that, I have the authority to make exceptions to radio silence, but he never delegated that down to anyone. So the Navy embarked on the operation and conducted most of the operation with the idea that their LCTs were on radio silence. The Army, however, on I think it was 25 May, issued a letter of instruction. And one of the items in that was radio silence. And it said, for DD tanks and a couple of other things, we authorized breaking radio silence at 0500 hours. So as we'll see, as continuing on, the Army could talk amongst themselves. Army Tank Company commanders and platoon leaders could talk among themselves. But the Navy wasn't aware of that and was operating as if they were on radio silence, which meant, once again, this is going to add to one of those communications breakdowns between the two halves of the operation.
Which is interesting too, because by 05, they're already in the transport areas, if memory serves, and pre-assault bombardment begins at what, 5:35, 5:36? I might be off.
540 to 550.
So by
the naval
05,
bombardment.
yeah, by 05, the Army's been given green light within the DD tank companies to talk amongst themselves, whereas the Navy, despite the fact within a scant 30 minutes, 40 minutes, the pre-assault bombardment's going to go, and the Germans are going to know everybody's there. And if they looked out on the ocean, they're going to see lots of boats anyway. So, I mean, it's counterintuitive that you would demand radio silence last until 05, but I guess you got to put a stop time somewhere or start time somewhere. So interesting that occurred.
At
it seems like
05,
the decisions are kind of made in a vacuum, about that, right?
By 05, the LCTs are actually far down the fire support lanes, and they're just shy of when they're going to turn for their deployment line. So things are a little bit advanced at this point. Now, the actual events on D-Day within the LCT units, they're clouded by conflicting, self-serving reports, faded memories. As noted earlier, most of the contemporary reports were kept from scrutiny by Rockwell himself. Following D-Day, he had all 16 LCT commanders, both Barry's division and his own division, submit reports on the landings. And most were informal, handwritten, and they varied in content. As noted, however, Rockwell submitted his own report before he received all of those reports, to include not receiving Barry's. Now, in his own report, Rockwell twisted the comments, the statements of the reports from his subordinates. And he never made the reports available to his own superiors. He kept them in his own personal files for 50 years. So the comments of these 16 men were hidden from officials and most historians over the years. And the events are further confused when Rockwell recorded a oral history for Stephen Ambrose back in the 1990s. And there are parts of that oral history that completely undercut some of Rockwell's own original report. So in this cloud of conflicting data, I'm going to try to present how I make sense of it all. And I got to stress that other people can interpret it differently, placing different weight on different accounts and credibility applied differently. But here's how I approached it. So the convoy reaches the transport area, and they get to a place called Point K. At Point K, they're going to be met by the Deputy Assault Group commanders of Assault Group 1 and 2. Now, the Deputy Assault Group commanders were kind of like the traffic cops for the two assault groups in the boat lanes. They're doing the actual hands-on coordination oversight of the movement in all the waves. So the LCTs carrying the DD tanks are supposed to be met at Point King by each of the two Deputy Assault Group commanders. Now, Rockwell's division at Point King is going to turn into the Western Fire Support Lane and start heading down towards their beach. Barry's division is going to continue on eastward more till they reach Point King 2, which is the head of their own fire support lane. At that time, Barry's division is moving in two sections, but as they head up to Point King 2, they're supposed to move in. Second section falls in behind Barry's section. Well, the guy who was the new section leader of the second section, because those roles had been changed by the change of formation, he'd been the tail end Charlie of his group too, so he wasn't the best navigator. And he didn't realize they'd reached that point and didn't do any of the switching until much later. Worse than that, though, was the third ship in his LCT section didn't realize they'd reached Point King. And he wandered off following Rockwell's group down that fire support lane. And with him, the last LCT followed along behind. The problem with this was that LCT that got lost was carrying Captain Thornton.
So the senior Army decision maker for the other small flotilla is now misaligned from where he's supposed to be.
Physically separated from the guys he's supposed to be commanding. Now, this was the same LCT that Barry commanded. Barry had been taken out of, and the tail end Charlie of the larger formation had put in charge in. So this is an example how one screw up at one point compounds itself until more and more screw ups occur, and you end up with a disaster.
And you're also battling the sea state at this point.
That's right.
Yeah. Which is affecting the formation, composition. Man,
and it's
just a toxic cocktail of all of it.
And it's pitch dark. It's first light is until 5:16, and these guys are at Point K making their change at about 3 a.m. In fact, it's so confusing and it's so dark and the weather conditions are so bad that one of the LCTs in Rockwell's division crashes into the battleship that's in the fire support lane. An anchored battleship. And that's partly a problem of how dark it was, and it's partly a problem of what poor sea keeping the heavily laden LCTs had, and partly due to the fact that the LCT skippers were extremely unskilled and unexperienced at that part. But anyhow, Barry's division, his truncated division, continues on, and they truck on up to Point K2. They turn right, and they head on down towards their line. Now, sometime in this period, we don't know quite when, but time-wise, we know that it occurred shortly after 0500 hours. Now, Captain Young was the company commander that was still with Barry, the second company commander. And he had called Thornton at about 0505 and said, hey, look, the weather here is kind of bad. I don't think we should launch. And he advised against launching. Thornton's out of position. He's over in a different lane. So he's in a very bad situation when it comes to trying to make a decision. And this is where things get very cloudy. Based on a crewman who was in Young's tank, his version of this conversation was that if they didn't launch and they're landing, they wouldn't land till later in the day. And so it appears that Thornton and Young finally decided that, look, it's a trade-off between I might lose some tanks, or the troops might not have tanks on the beach at all.
Mhm.
And so the decision apparently was, we're going to take the risk because they need to have tanks there right at the beginning. And again, although the Navy order said they would be landed with the first wave if there's a weather problem, that was a Navy order, and we don't know that the Army was aware of it all. And from what we can tell of the Army decision process, that's kind of what they were going for in their mind.
Yeah. Interesting.
Accurate or not, there's confusion. Even if you go with my interpretation of it, you have to understand what level of confusion was slipping away there. So Young gets that information, and he passes that on his radio net to the other 3 LCTs that are carrying his troops. We don't know if the 2 remaining LCTs that were with Barry from Thornton's group got that message or not. But 3 of the LCT commanders got the word from their Army lieutenants or from Young himself saying that we're going to go ahead and launch. Barry claims that he didn't get that word. And we have no way of knowing whether he's right or not because we don't have any word from anybody on any of the tankers on his ship. But they get into position, and then another strange coincidence happens. They'd been led into position by a guide craft. And after they got in that position, the guide craft turned around and started coming down the column. That passed Barry's craft and then came up to the LCT number 2, 3, and 4 in order, and informed each of those craft commanders that you're at position. It's up to the DD tanks now. LCT commanders thought, okay, he's coming from Barry's direction. This is Barry's implementing order for us to go ahead and launch. So everyone launches.
And what's their range to beach at this point? How far out are they?
It's a little bit disputed. Some say they launched at 6,000 yards out. Some say they went into about 5,000 yards, but It's still beyond the 4,000 yard recommended limit.
Sure. And again, we're talking the sea state isn't the same in what they trained in. So this is a completely foreign environment for them, not to mention the fact they're unsure how far out they are. So, I mean, again, terrifies the hell out of me thinking about being on one of those tanks. Just mind-boggling.
Now, over on the 2 tanks from Thornton's division that followed Barry, they weren't on the same radio net. But one of the LCT commanders there said, hey, the LCT to my left started launching. And, we were on radio silence. And so our instructions were, when the guy to the left launches, we launch too. So they just fell into the same process. So that ended up with all 6 of the LCTs launching their DD tanks, except for one. Ensign Sullivan in LCT 600. His first tank had sunk, and he decided to take his remaining 3 tanks all the way to the beach. His excuse was that the screens were damaged on the remaining 3 tanks, but I think he just had the courage to say, no, this is going to work, and overrode it. But about half, not quite half of the tanks sank within about 100 yards of their LCTs. Several of the LCT commanders said, no, when we left, all the tanks were heading to the beach and were in fine condition. Others, said, no, they went right under. So we don't really know at this point exactly which tank sank where. I'd love to have that data from the ocean somewhere. I know they've done some surveys down where the tanks are, but don't have full data on it.
Now the tanks that came off of Sullivan's craft, these are the ones that we have pictures of operating on the beach, or at least they look like they're operating. They could have been knocked out at that point, I guess, near WN62.
Yeah, they're in Kappa's photos. Kappa's photos show 2 of these, and a third one shows up in Chief Photographer's mate Ruli's motion picture film from the same spot. So if there's 3 together and only 5 landed, then they're probably all 3 from Sullivan's unit.
Yeah.
Okay. Now over in where Thornton is,
which makes sense when you think about it, because there's one picture, at least 2 of them look like they're trundling down the beach parallel to the water line, which would put them heading towards I believe it was a 76 millimeter pack gun in WN62 that's firing west up the beach.
Yes.
So yep. It makes, yeah. And for those of our Patreon subscribers, I'm going to have all the pictures I have of the DD tanks that are operating in that area, plus some photos of WN62 from that gun position. I'll get those all loaded up. I think they'll be great to support what Chuck's narrative here and give everybody kind of a visual of what was going on at that point.
Now, Thornton's lost 2 LCTs, the ones that are following Rockwell. At some point, they realized they are lost. There's some question about when they did that and whether they were told to get over there or not. But they then cut diagonally across the boat lanes, and the launches have already taken place in the other LCTs. So they continue on until they're far enough towards the shore that they're abreast of the surviving DD tanks as they're swimming. And they then launch even with them in the hopes that they'll all land together. And of course, they don't end up not having much more luck than any of the others did when it comes to hitting the beach. So that's kind of what happened over in Barry's area.
Mm-hmm.
So it appears that the launchings went automatically. They were reinforced by the mistaken idea of the lead or the guide craft coming down and telling them to launch. But there's another point. The deputy assault group commander for that area, he led the LCTs down the group or down the fire support lane, and he had a conversation with Barry in his LCT before they turned into the parallel to the beach. So you got a Captain Imlay, his Coast Guard officer. He was there at the launch line, saw the conditions at the launch line, and apparently either thought the conditions were good enough or didn't have the moxie to interfere and stop the launching, because he said nothing to prevent the launchings there. Now that's a well-seasoned naval officer, or Coast Guard officer, and his appreciation for the launching conditions at the time. And we'll get a little bit more into the launching conditions later on. Well, actually, let's go ahead and do that now.
Yeah, because this definitely contributes to the mess that's occurring, and we've talked about it on the fringes on the way in, but I think it definitely now is probably a good time to discuss that.
I went through all the action reports of the craft that were close inshore on D-Day. Offshore, the weather was worse than it was inshore. So there were 2 destroyers and 1 patrol craft that were inshore, or close inshore to the beach that day. Now there's a 4th destroyer which was out by Pointe du Hoc, but Pointe du Hoc is near Pointe et Raz de la Percée. Now the et Raz means and tidal race. So out in that direction, the tides are much stronger around the tidal race of the point. So I've kind of discarded his report simply because he's in a unique area. The 3 remaining ones, one of them just reported a. I'm going to pull that up so I don't end up lying to you. Okay. As for the wind, 2 destroyers. They all reported the wind was at state 3, which is within acceptable conditions. As for the sea state, 1 reported state 2, well below the state 3 limit. 1 reported a slight swell, which presumably is below the limit. And the 3rd, the patrol craft, reported state 4. So now the 2 destroyer captains are extremely experienced folks at this point, relatively speaking. And they both thought that the weather conditions, as they reported them, were acceptable. So they all may have been wrong, but what that shows is that Thornton's judgment wasn't outrageously reckless. He was no more wrong than senior experienced naval officers were. So to me, that kind of casts his judgment in a different light. It was incorrect, but he wasn't rash and stupid as people normally just assume. That's my interpretation. Now, let's shift over now to Assault Group 02. And this is the division that Rockwell was leading. Rockwell Rockwell's original report is that at about 0505, just before turning parallel to the beach at the 6,000-yard line, and just after radio silence had been lifted for the tankers, Rockwell and Elder supposedly had a conversation, and both men supposedly agreed the weather is too bad for launching. Elder was a senior tank captain, company commander. And as a result, according to the official Navy version, all 32 DD tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion made it safely ashore, being landed directly on the beach at H hour and on the correct beaches. But that wasn't entirely true. Reports from the LCT commanders in Rockwell's division indicated that when some of the LCTs beached, the water was too deep for the tanks to go off into without being flooded. And that caused a problem because some of the tankers, when they heard they're going to be landing on the beach, deflated their screens, and some of them even threw overboard parts of their swimming gear. So the landing of the tanks was delayed while they tried to get the screens back up, tried to get the tanks back into launching position. In some cases, the LCTs had to pull off and beach again once or twice just to find some place that was shallow enough to put the tanks in. Like I said, the gradient at Torcross was different than the gradient at Omaha Beach. So there's a little difference in what they're expecting when they brought their bows. Now, despite that, Admiral Hall endorsements of Rockwell and Elder held them up as the ideal solution and praised them for the implementation of the policy that he supposedly directed. The problem is not all of the evidence seems to support that. Two oral histories from the 743rd Tank Battalion tankers paint a different picture. Now, they were recorded in the 1980s. Therefore, they were subject to the vagaries of time and memory. And so you can question their memories, question these accounts. Nevertheless, these men were adamant they were launched and swam in from well over 1,000 yards offshore. And that directly contradicts the official story of it.
Yeah, that's a big difference between beaching the craft and then dropping ramp and driving off.
Yeah. Now, one of them stated that 3 tanks behind him in the LCD launched after him, and they all sank and went right to the bottom, losing about half the crewmen. Now, while their memories can be doubted, their comments nevertheless are consistent with the 743rd Tank Battalion's report that states only half of Company B's tanks made it to the beach or made it ashore. So the saga may have rested there, with only small nagging doubts about Rockwell's version of events and Hall's apologia. But then Rockwell's oral history recording resurfaced, and the entire complexion of the affair changed. I'm going to quote from Rockwell's report here, literally, or from his oral history. Now, he was just talking casually, and so his syntax and sentence structure is a little bit confusing. So if it sounds odd, it's his words. It's not my butchering of it.
Yeah, you're just reading it verbatim. So.
Okay. Quote, but the sea state was running very heavily. And after launching 1 or 2 tanks and having them become swamped with water and go down, I was in communications by low power tank radio, parentheses, even though all communications was forbidden prior to H hour, the decision to launch or not to launch into the sea was absolutely critical to the success of the invasion. We broke radio silence. What the hell? The Germans knew what was about to happen, in parentheses. With a Captain Elder of the 743rd Tank Battalion, we made the joint decision that it would be insane to launch any more tanks, and the signal was given by tank radio to all craft to cease the launch. The next signal to our landing craft and to the tank commanders was that we would proceed to the beach, which we did. End quote. Now that's a huge statement.
Yeah, there's a lot rolled into that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. First, his interpretation of radio silence and breaking radio silence. For him, it was breaking radio silence. For the tankers, it wasn't.
Yeah. So first, it indicates that contrary to all previous official reports, his division did launch 1 or 2 tanks. Personally, Rockwell was precise about everything else, down to the second of when he beached. And when you start getting vague about things about, well, we had these many losses, that sounds to me like he's kind of not facing up to the issue, and probably the number's a little bit higher. I can't prove that, but that's just how it appears to me. But second, it indicates that the launching sequence was activated automatically in his division, just as it was in Barry's. They reached the launch line, and Rockwell, despite claiming he knew the sea was far too rough, had no role in the initial process of launching the first tanks or giving orders. He could not have, because he didn't, by his own statement, he didn't break radio silence until after the loss of the initial tanks. So he did not have positive control at that point, as he's always been credited with. Third, it means that Rockwell's report was clearly wrong when he claimed the decision to land was made at 0505 hours. And that's because the launch of the DD tanks didn't occur till 0535 hours. And he and Elders, by Rockwell's old admission, didn't talk until after the first tanks had launched. So this is another report, another comment, one of many in Rockwell's report that just weren't accurate.
Yeah, it counters the original guidance / agreement that the Army commander would be the one who decided on when it was safe to launch the tanks. So by his own admission and his own statement, he was silent and did not, didn't object to the launching of the tanks, at least a couple of them before they went off the end and sank right to the bottom. Interesting. I will say this. This is not a defense of his decision-making cycle. After 40 plus years, it may have been his own internal defense mechanism to feel less responsible for the death of the tankers. And again, I'm not saying it's calculated. That might have been just an internal reaction to his own guilt over the loss of the tankers. And he may have just, his defense mechanism in terms of his thought process is where he arrives with that statement.
We're all human.
Yeah.
And we all tend to color things.
And I want to make sure we get that in there. There's a human aspect to this,
yes,
especially as we get older and older. And especially if you're a combat veteran and something might have gone sideways during your time in combat, there is a tendency for, I'm not saying people lie. I'm just saying there's a defense mechanism that is built into everybody's psyche. And sometimes you want to lessen your own guilt. Maybe this was a defense mechanism of his, so he didn't feel responsible for the loss of those first two tank crews.
Yeah. Now, the fourth point that comes out of this, from my perspective, is that the radio silence issue. Rockwell thought he was in radio silence, and no rational man would go on another service's net and break radio silence on their net. And he thought he was on radio silence. So to me, and this is my interpretation, that means that it was Elder who initiated the conversation. He called Rockwell and said, look, I want to be landed. And so Rockwell probably didn't have much of a role in the decision to land. He was asked to do it by Elder, by my interpretation, and he just executed it properly.
Plus by that time, the secured communications at that point, the radio silence is lifted for the Navy at 05. So even by then, he should have been, at least in his own mind, prepared to initiate radio contact.
No, the initial radio silence for the Navy hadn't been lifted at that point.
Oh, okay. I thought we were at 05 for them.
No, they were later. They were first contact with the enemy was how this is listed.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Huh, interesting.
Now, I went back and tried to see what the LCT commanders, Rockwell's LCT commanders, had to say about it. And they didn't really shed much light on it. They pretty much closely agreed to Rockwell's official report, excepting they included the various maneuvers of trying to beaching that Rockwell had left out.
And these are the post-operational accounts, not 40 years down the road. So the memories are much sharper at that point.
Yeah. But it's that very support that, to me, starts casting doubt on their accuracy. And I'll give you an example of that. There's a guy named Captain Sabin, Sabin, and he was in command of the gunfire support groups. And the gunfire support groups were the small craft, which were inshore, providing last-minute fire support for the LCTs. Some of them accompanied the LCTs all the way to the beach. Some of them were firing the rockets. But he remained inshore during and after Rockwell's folks landed the tanks. While he was there, after the tanks were landed, he reported he noticed 3 craft coming from the direction of Utah Beach. So the 3 craft, it turned out, had gotten lost in the chaos offshore, had gone to the wrong beach. And he reported them showing up well after launch time of the tanks. One of those was an LCT that belonged to Rockwell's division carrying some of the tanks. Now, that wasn't included in Rockwell's report. He didn't include that. And none of his LCT commanders owned up to it. But Saban's account is actually verified by a lieutenant who was aboard that craft. Their engine had conked out in mid-channel. They got separated. They finally got them started, but ended up in the wrong place. And he reported they showed up late and were eventually landed on the beach. So the reports of Rockwell's LCT commanders didn't mention any of this. None of the guys fessed up to being lost or late or whatever, and none of them fessed up to launching tanks offshore, making them swim in. So who you believe is really a question of how you interpret this here, and it isn't clear, but we have reports from both sides of this. Now, none of that changes the fact that the bulk of the 743rd Tank Battalion's tanks made it ashore. And it doesn't change the fact that only 5 of the 741st Battalion's tanks made it ashore. But it should change how we view how Hall apportioned blame. He praised Rockwell and Elder for correctly implementing the supposed joint decision policy while using good judgment in the process. On the other hand, he chastised Barry for being passive and not taking action, and criticized Thornton for unilaterally making a decision to land. But now we see that in reality, neither division was Hall's policy followed. Both divisions, the operation initially proceeded identically. In both divisions, the LCTs arrived at the launching line, and without communication between the physically separated Army and Navy leaders, the launching process proceeded automatically. Presumably, this meant both Thornton and Elder thought the weather, although marginal, would be good enough. While Barry and Rockwell later claimed they knew the seas were too rough, neither of them made any attempt to contact their Army counterpart to prevent the start of launching. The only difference between the actions of the two divisions is in the Rockwell and Elder unit, the launching was stopped when the first tanks were lost, however many that was. In the other division, however, this was impossible because Thornton was physically aboard the lost LCT and not within visual sight of the rest of his tankers. He wasn't aware of the disaster that was happening as they rolled off the ramps. So he's not able to intervene and stop the launching. And the blame for that, if you want to assign blame, largely rests with Rockwell's because of the late switching of LCT commanders and the confusion over embarkation. Again, small errors in the earlier process combined to snowball into a disaster at the last.
One thing that stands out to me is instead of moving Barry from his LCT to the number 4 one in his flotilla, why not just switch the boats themselves in their rack and stack?
Good point. And that's because they had already been loaded with the tanks. And if you switched the boats, you had the wrong tanks going to the wrong beach. And with the tankers at a separate base, sequestered, there was nobody to move the tanks from LCT to LCT.
Yeah.
And that again goes to the fact that there is such a division between coordination, synchronization of plans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by getting the jump on loading the tanks early, before the orders are out, they just
blessing
put
and a curse.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, in my mind, the bottom line is that neither Barry or Thornton deserve the blame that Hall and history have heaped on them. But neither are blameless either. Thornton was in a nearly impossible situation, being out of position when the decision was called for. And Barry's authority apparently was limited by the results of the meeting with Rockwell that Rockwell had with the battalion commanders, which said it's the Army decision. On the other hand, Rockwell and Elder don't entirely deserve the unqualified praise that's been lavished on them. I mean, they did a good job. They got their tanks ashore, but it wasn't as clean an operation as Hall would portray it. And in my mind, at least, Rockwell comes in for considerable criticism for his self-serving and deceptive action report, at least in my opinion, as well as his repeated bad judgment in organizing and embarking the LCT divisions. But above all else, the father of the disaster is Rear Admiral Hall, whose negative attitude towards the concept resulted in a thoroughly muddled assignment of authority and responsibilities, which permeated every level of planning and execution.
Yeah, when you're the boss, when things go wrong, it's your responsibility. But in this case, it's not just the mistakes made at the operational and tactical level. It was also the planning level, the strategic level, with this in terms of planning, where he doesn't do a good enough job of detailing his guidance, and it directly affects the landings because it allows for all of the vagaries to come to the fore and affect how the tanks end up being deployed. I mean, it's a snowball effect. It's a compounding effect of when you issue vague orders, you allow for a lot of mistakes to be or a lot of situations to be misinterpreted, and then actions taken that you don't necessarily want to happen in the way they happen. But because you did not prepare and issue the proper orders, this is the end result.
Now,
I mean, and to think that a task force commander is going to issue orders all the way down to the smallest vessel or smallest flotilla portion is probably a little odd. It's probably his staff that probably needed to be a little bit more on the ball in terms of going back to him for clarification on points before issuing the orders down the chain of command. But still, yeah, the buck stops with him. It's his command.
But that brings up some very interesting points. You never want to lose sight of the size and complexity of this operation. It was huge. And although they had several months to put it together, not all the pieces were there early enough to put everything together properly in sequence and coordination and whatnot. So it was a big, tough operation. And you got to give it credit, it worked. It wasn't pretty all the time, but it worked. But having said that, Ramsey, the naval commander for the Allies.
Yeah, Bertram Ramsey.
Yep. Yeah, he had visited Hall's command in mid-March and was not at all satisfied with the state of planning. He criticized that Hall hadn't organized into subgroups, hadn't given the subgroups planning requirements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, Hall came up with some excuses. He didn't have the people and whatever. So those excuses weren't good enough. You know, he should have got the people. He should have done this. So Ramsey wasn't satisfied at all with Hall's planning process. And you can probably see some of that in Hall's planning, that his staff was not operating as efficiently as it could be. And even Hall, in his own after-action report, said that he had some faults in instruction in his planning process. So there was probably a degree there that could have been performed much better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've given everybody a ton of information to process and think about. And not only that, again, laid it out very, very well in your series of blog posts about this topic. I mean, if you don't have the number off the top of your head, I understand. But how many tanks were destined to Omaha? How many DDs were destined for Omaha? And then how many successfully landed? Do you recall off the top of your head?
Okay, it would be 64 tanks, 32 in each of the two areas. In the 01 area, it was only 5 that made it ashore. In the 02 area, one company made it ashore with all their tanks, supposedly. They lost 2 quickly afterwards. In the company B, I believe it was, they only got 16 of their tanks ashore. Correction, they only got 8 of their tanks out of 16 ashore. And that doesn't count what losses then occurred from enemy fire once they were on
Right.
the sand.
But how many landed successfully, we'll say, out of the 64?
64, 5 and 24.
18, 24.
Yeah, about 29.
So less than half of the intended fire support,
Yeah,
the mobile fire support on the beaches landed.
yeah.
I mean, and you're an infantryman, you're a dog face that's landing, and you're promised you're going to have tank support. And by and large, it didn't show up because of a number of errors that happened. I mean, like you said, some of these tanks are knocked out like right after they landed, because some of them, because of navigational errors, are put right in the devil's den essentially, and they're knocked out immediately. So I mean, even then, despite the fact that you have, just under 50% of your tanks going ashore, some of them are knocked out right away. This has an effect going forward, right?
You can only imagine how much better it would have been in the 16th area if they've gotten all their tanks ashore, because one of those early tanks knocked out the 88 millimeter gun over in WN61, I think it was.
Yeah, I believe so.
Knocked that out early, which made a big difference to that end of the beach. Another one of the tanks knocked out the two 75, 76 millimeter guns that were in WN62. Now, they were recrewed and put back into action several times during the day.
Yep.
But it could have been a lot worse. If they'd had all their tanks there, it could have made a much bigger difference on this.
Yeah, the opening of the
carnage.
causeway happened much earlier in the day, and might not have the efforts of Spalding and Dawson and those guys to get their troops up the hill and start working through the German defenses. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened. It was going to happen probably anyway, but it might have been a lot easier on them and the other infantry elements if the tanks had landed and been able to provide that critical fire support at the waterline and just up to the shingle.
Yeah, I remember one of the tanks fired, I think it was 150 rounds before they were flooded out. They were stranded in the water. Now, 150 rounds of 75 millimeter is pretty good in support. And if you'd multiplied that by the number of tanks that should have been there, that could have been quite a bit.
Yeah, and several of these were towing ammunition trailers with them. So it's well above the standard load for an M4 Sherman.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're not only are they running through all the ammunition on board the tank, but they're resupplying out of their trailer and they're firing that as well. I mean, that's 100+ rounds coming out of a tank in a short period of time. That's just an amazing amount of fire support being provided.
One of the pictures I think you're going to post, if I interpret it correctly, the ones that has the DD tanks along the beach.
Yeah, they're trundling to the east.
Yeah, one of them has a DD tank. It's up mired in the sand, but it's got its ammo trailer there. It's open, and they're reloading the tank with ammo right then. So,
yeah. Well, and I'll post these up. But Chuck, thanks so much, man. I've really enjoyed this. This is a great. It's a great topic to sit there and sink your teeth into, and I think you did a wonderful job in doing so. And again, we'll post the Chuck's website so you can go back and read the articles. They're well sourced, and I think you'll find them riveting. And again, we'll post the link up to Back into Focus, so folks who want to pick that up can do so. And as well as Spearheading D-Day, we'll post links up for that as well. Chuck, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Joe. It's great. I always enjoy it, and you can run a great podcast here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, my friend.